Vance stepped through the broken door with a revolver in each hand. Cass was on his knees, bleeding. Della stood 6 paces away, a small Colt steady in her hands, and looked the man who had crossed half a continent to murder her dead in the eye. "Mr. Vance," she said, "my name in this house is Della. This is the story of how a Boston governess found home in a Wyoming cabin with 3 mountain men and how she learned to fight for it. The wind came down off the Wind River Range like something with teeth. It carried the smell of snow that had not yet fallen and the older smell of snow that had. It pushed through the lodgepole pines that rattled the bare aspens and made the canvas of a broken wagon snap somewhere down in the white throat of the canyon. The sound carried for half a mile in that cold. It was the only sound for half a mile in any direction. Cassius Thorne heard it before he saw the wagon. He sat his horse at the lip of the ridge and listened. The mare under him, a bay named Bess, who had carried him through 11 Wyoming winters, blew steam from her nostrils and stamped once and went still. Cass listened the way a man listens who has spent most of his 33 years learning that silence in this country is a kind of language, and that broken silence is usually a warning. Behind him, 2 other riders came up through the trees. The first was Jeremiah, the middle brother, 31 years old, riding the gray gelding he had broken himself when he was 19. Jem rode the way he did most things quietly, with both hands easy on the reins and his eyes always moving. The second was Rourke, the youngest, 29, mounted on the black he called Trouble, for reasons the horse had earned. Rourke had a Winchester across his thighs and a face that did not yet know what was waiting at the bottom of the canyon, but his horse knew, and the horse was unhappy. "Cass," Rourke said. "I hear it," Cass said. He nudged Bess forward and started down. The descent took 10 minutes. The trail was all loose scree and old ice, and the horses picked their way without being told. Cass said nothing the whole way down. He had said almost nothing for 2 days, not since the storm had come in off the Tetons and pinned them all to the cabin and made him understand with a cold certainty he could not shake that he was going to be too late. The letter had said the stagecoach would reach Cheyenne on the 3rd of January. The arrangement was that a hired wagon would carry her north from there with a driver named Henley and 2 outriders, and that they would meet Cass at the trading post at South Pass on the 7th. From South Pass, it was 1 more day to Thorn Ridge. Cass had ridden out on the 5th, meaning to be early, meaning to be the first thing she saw when she stepped down off that wagon, hat in hand, beard-combed boots cleaned with bear grease for the first time in a year. He had practiced what he meant to say. He had practiced it on the trail and in the dark, and to the indifferent ears of his horse. The storm had hit on the morning of the 6th. It had pinned him in a line shack 20 miles south of the pass for 2 full days, and when he had finally pushed out into the white world on the morning of the 9th, he had ridden hard back to Thorn Ridge for his brothers, because some animal part of him already knew. Whatever had been waiting at South Pass had not waited long enough. They reached the canyon floor. The wagon lay on its side against the granite teeth of the cliff. Its canvas top was torn into long, pale ribbons that lifted and fell in the wind like the breathing of something not quite dead. 1 wheel was gone entirely. The other 3 were splintered. The tongue had snapped. The team was nowhere run off or driven off or eaten by what came down out of the timber after dark. 4 bodies lay in the snow. Cass dismounted. He did not hurry. He had seen worse things in worse places between 61 and 65, and he had learned that hurrying did no service to the dead. He walked the perimeter first the way his father had taught him, reading the snow before he read the men. The drifts had filled in much of the story, but not all of it. He could see where horses had come in from the north, 6 or 7 of them, and where they had fanned out, and where they had gone again southeast toward the Sweetwater country. He could see one place where a man had fallen, and another where a man had crawled, and a third where a man had died sitting up against a wagon wheel with his pistol still in his hand. Jem went to the bodies. Rourke walked the wagon. He picked up a smashed lockbox and turned it over in his hands and let it fall. "Henley," Jem said quietly, kneeling by the man with the pistol. And the two boys he hired out of Rawlins. And this one I don't know. Driver for the lady, Cass said. Yeah. How long? Jem touched the frost on the dead man's coat. He pressed two fingers to the wood of the wagon bed and watched how the cold came back into them. 2 days, he said. Maybe 3. Cass closed his eyes. He stood there in the wind with his eyes closed and his hat in his hand and let the cold take what it wanted from his face. He had carried the letter in his coat for 6 months. He had read it so many times the creases had begun to fail. He had memorized the slope of her handwriting and the small, careful ways she made her capital letters, and the line near the end where she had written, I do not know what kind of woman you are looking for, Mr. Thorne, but I will try to be the kind you need. He had not even seen her face. Cass, Rourke said. His voice had changed. Cass opened his eyes. Rourke was standing 20 feet from the wagon on the north side where a stand of young firs came down to the canyon floor. He was looking at the snow between his boots. He was looking at a single small footprint half filled with new powder. Cass, he said again. She walked out. For a long moment, Cass did not move. Then he moved. The three brothers spread out along the line of trees and read the snow the way other men read scripture, slowly and with their full attention. The trail was almost gone. 2.5 days of wind had nearly buried it. But Rourke had been tracking elk and wolf and stray cattle in this country since he was 8 years old, and there was very little the snow could hide from him if he was patient. He found a second print. He found a third. He found a place where she had fallen and gotten up again. He found a place where she had stopped and rested against a deadfall and left a single dark thread caught in the bark, a thread the color of midnight, the color of a Boston traveling dress. She went up, Rourke said, toward the rocks, alive when she went up, alive when she fell down twice and got up twice. After that, I can't say. They left the horses with Jem and went up on foot. The slope was steep, and the wind on the open face was worse than down in the canyon. Cass moved first, breaking trail, and Rourke read sign behind him. Twice they lost her, and twice Rourke found her again. They climbed for an hour. Cass did not let himself think. Thinking was a thing he had learned to set aside in places like this, the way a man sets aside a heavy coat before he swings an axe. There would be time to think later, or there would not. It was Rourke who heard her. He stopped on the slope and held up one hand and tilted his head and listened the way a hunting dog listens. The wind dropped for one heartbeat, and in that heartbeat, there was a sound that was not the wind. It was very small. It was the sound a small animal makes when it has stopped trying to get away and has only enough breath left to be afraid. There, Rourke whispered, under the overhang. She was tucked into a hollow in the rocks where a slab of granite leaned out far enough to keep most of the snow off. She had pulled her traveling cloak around her and pulled her knees up under it and folded her arms inside and made herself as small as a person can make themselves and still go on living. Her face was the color of old wax. Her lips were the color of a bruise. Her hair, what they could see of it under her hood, was the color of honey held up against firelight, and there was frost in it. She was holding a small carpet bag against her chest with both hands. Cass dropped to his knees in the snow. He took off one glove with his teeth and put 2 fingers against the side of her throat under the cloak. He held them there. He held them there a long time. The wind came down off the rocks above them and sang in a thin voice through the firs, and somewhere very far away, a raven called once and went silent. Cass, Rourke said. Wait. He held his fingers there, and then he felt it. A flutter no more than the wing of a moth against glass, but a flutter. Something in him that had been tied tight for 2 days came loose all at once, and he had to set his other hand against the rock to steady himself. She's alive, he said. Rourke let out a breath that he had not known he was holding. Cass took off his sheepskin coat. He took it off in the howling wind on the open mountain in January, and he wrapped her in it the way a man wraps a thing he has been waiting his whole life to be allowed to touch, and he gathered her up against his chest. She weighed nothing. She weighed less than nothing. He could feel her ribs through 3 layers of cloth. He looked down at her face. He had not seen her before except in the small, careful handwriting of a letter and in the kind of dreams a lonely man does not admit to even in daylight. He saw her now. He saw the high cheekbones and the soft mouth and the long lashes pale with frost, and he saw a bruise the color of plums on her temple where the wagon had thrown her when it went over. He bent his head close to her ear. "You came so far," he said. "Don't you leave me now." The going down was harder than the going up. Cass carried her himself the whole way. He would not let Rourke take her. Halfway down the slope, he slipped on a patch of black ice and went to one knee, hard enough that he felt something tear in the muscle of his back, and he did not even slow. He came down off the mountain with her in his arms, and his teeth set, and his eyes fixed on the place at the bottom where Jem was waiting with the horses. Jem saw them coming, and his face changed. "Get on," Cass said. "Ride. Get the fire built up and the kettle on. Oats and water. Get the bed in the loft warmed. Bring out Mama's old blankets, the wool ones in the cedar chest. Go." Jem did not waste a word. He swung onto the gray and was gone up the canyon in a spray of snow. Rourke held Bess steady while Cass mounted with the woman in his arms. They started for home. The ride to Thorn Ridge was 18 miles. Cass made it in 3 hours through snow that came up to his stirrups in places. He did not feel the cold. He did not feel the tear in his back. He felt only the small, fluttering pulse against the inside of his arm and the impossible lightness of her body and the way her head had fallen against his chest as if it belonged there and had only been waiting to find the way home. The sky was already going purple in the west when they came up out of the last draw and saw the cabin. Thorn Ridge sat in a fold of the foothills with the Wind River Range standing behind it like a wall the world had set there to keep certain men safe. The cabin was a 2-story thing of squared logs that Cass and Jem and Rourke and their father had raised in the summer of '66, the year after Cass came home from the war, the year their father was still alive to tell them how to do it. The roof was steep against snow load. The chimney was riverstone. There was smoke coming out of the chimney now in a thick, urgent column, and there were lanterns lit in every window, and Cass had never in his life been so glad to see a house. Jem was waiting in the dooryard. He had ridden ahead and the smoke was already up out of the chimney. He took Bess's bridle without a word, and Cass came down out of the saddle, still holding her. Jem saw the woman in his brother's arms, and his face did not change much, because Jem's face rarely changed much, but his eyes changed. "Loft," he said. "Loft," Cass said. They went in. The cabin smelled of pine smoke, and the iron smell of a kettle on the boil, and the older smells that lived in the wood itself, leather and gun oil, in the years of 3 men cooking the same plain food in the same plain way. Cass climbed the loft ladder 1 rung at a time with her in his arms and laid her on his own bed, the largest of the 3, the one closest to the chimney where the heat came up through the stones. Jem came up behind him with an armful of wool blankets and a copper basin of water that was not hot, only just warm. He set the basin down. He did not let Cass take her boots off. "Slow," Jem said. "If we warm her too fast, her heart will stop." "I know. I know you know. I'm telling you anyway. Sit down." Cass sat down on the floor next to the bed because his legs had decided all at once that they were finished. He sat with his back against the bed frame and watched his brother work. Jem was the one who knew about hurts. He had learned it from their mother before she died and from an old Shoshone woman who had lived 2 valleys over until the winter of '73, and from a book on field medicine that he had bought off a peddler in Pinedale and read until the binding came apart. He worked now the way he always worked, slowly and without speaking, his hands moving over the woman. The way a man's hands move over a young horse he means to gentle. He warmed cloths in the basin and laid them along her wrists and her ankles where the blood came nearest the skin. He put a small wedge of wood between her teeth and tried to get a spoonful of broth past her tongue. Most of it ran out. Some of it did not. He worked for an hour. Then he sat back on his heels and looked at Cass. "She'll live," Jem said. Cass closed his eyes. She's strong, Jem said. Stronger than she has any right to be. 2 days in that cold without a fire, and she's still got a pulse you can feel. I don't know who she is, brother, but she came up out of Boston with iron in her bones. Adelaide, Cass said. His voice was rough. Her name is Adelaide Whitlock. She goes by Della. Della, Jem said, and tried the name out. All right, Della. Down below, the front door opened and closed, and Rourke's boots crossed the puncheon floor, and Rourke called up the ladder in a voice he was trying to keep low. Cass, we need to talk. In the morning. No, now. Cass got up. He looked once at the woman on the bed, at the small, impossible rise and fall of the wool blanket over her chest. And then he climbed down the ladder into the warm yellow light of the front room, where his brother was waiting for him with his hat in his hand. Rourke had built up the fire. He turned when Cass came down the last rung, and his eyes were the eyes of a man who had been thinking too hard for too long on a ride home through bad country. Tell me, Cass said. 6 riders, Rourke said, maybe 7. They came in from the south and they left going southeast toward the Sweetwater. They knew what they were doing, Cass. That wasn't road agents. Road agents don't kill 4 armed men and then take nothing out of a strong box they already broke open. They were looking for her. You're sure, and I'm sure. Cass walked to the fire and put his hands flat against the stones above the mantel and let the heat work into them. For a long time he did not speak. Above them the loft was silent. Jem had finished his work and would be sitting up there now watching her breathe. The way Jem watched things he had decided to be responsible for. There's a thing I need to tell you both, Cass said loud enough for the loft to hear. Up above, there was the small sound of Jem shifting his weight to listen. I never told her about you, Cass said. In the letters, I said my family. I let her think that meant a mother and a sister, or a mother alone, or maybe an old uncle. I never wrote down that there were 3 of us up here. I was afraid if she knew she would not come. Rourke set his hat down on the table very slowly. Cass, I know. She's going to wake up tomorrow morning in a strange bed, in a strange country, and she's going to come down that ladder, and she's going to find 3 bearded mountain men staring at her, and one of them is going to be the man she thinks she promised to marry. I know. She's going to put a knife in somebody, Rourke said. From the loft, Jem made a small sound that in another man might have been a laugh. She might at that, Jem said quietly down through the hatch. Cass turned around. The firelight was on one side of his face, and the dark of the room was on the other. Whoever wanted her dead is still out there, he said, and they don't know yet that they failed. When they find out, they'll come up this canyon. So here's how it is going to be. She will sleep in the loft. Tomorrow when she wakes up, I will tell her the truth, all of it, and she will be free to choose. If she wants to go back to Boston in the spring, I will pay her passage and I will not say one word against it. Until the spring, she is safe under this roof, and she will not be touched, and she will not be looked at the wrong way, and she will not be made to feel that anything is owed. Are we agreed? We're agreed, Jem said from the loft. Rourke nodded once. Agreed. I'll sleep in the barn tonight, Cass said. In this cold, in this cold. Rourke opened his mouth and then closed it again. He had known his oldest brother for 29 years, and he knew when an argument was going to be a waste of breath. I'll go with you, he said instead. No, you stay in the front room with one rifle. Jem stays in the kitchen with the other. Nobody comes through that door tonight without going through one of you first. I don't think they followed her up the canyon, but I am not in a mood to be wrong twice in 1 week. He took a wool coat from the peg by the door, the heavy one, the one their father had worn the winter he died. He put it on. He stopped with his hand on the latch. A man keeps his word, he said quietly, almost to himself, even when the word is to a woman who has not woken up yet. He went out into the cold. Della Whitlock came back from a long way away. She came back slowly in pieces through layers of dark and pain and the strange warm smell of a woolen blanket that was not hers. For a long time, she did not know where she was. She knew only that she was no longer in the snow and that her hands and her feet hurt very much in a way that meant they were still attached to her and that someone somewhere was making coffee. She opened her eyes. Wood. Pine wood, plain smooth and joined tight the underside of a sloping roof. A small square window with frost flowers on the inside of the glass. A heavy wool blanket the color of cream. A second blanket over that one dark gray. The faint warm orange of firelight coming up through a square hole in the floor at the foot of the bed. She was alive. She was alive and she was indoors and she was warm and she was not by any of the small, careful tests her body could make hurt in any way that mattered. She turned her head. There was a tin cup of water on a small crate beside the bed. There was a pair of soft moccasins set neatly on the floor where her feet could reach them. There was a folded towel and a bar of plain yellow soap. There was leaning against the wall near the bed, her own carpet bag, the small one she had carried up out of the canyon, the one with her mother's cameo brooch sewn into the lining, and her father's pocket Bible inside the change of underclothes. Someone had carried her bag up here and set it where she could see it the moment she opened her eyes. Della Whitlock, who had not cried in front of anyone since she was 11 years old, felt her throat close up. She lay still and let it pass. Then she sat up, slowly. The room moved a little and then steadied. She put her bare feet over the edge of the bed onto the moccasins, which were lined with rabbit fur, and she stood up and she went to the head of the loft ladder and looked down. There were three of them, three men in the front room around the fire, three large men, all of them tall, all of them broad through the shoulder, all of them with the kind of hands she had only ever seen on dock workers and farriers. One was sitting at the table cleaning a long rifle. One was crouched at the hearth feeding small split logs into a fire. The third was standing with his back to the ladder, staring into the flames, and even from above and behind she could see that he had not slept. The one at the table looked up. He saw her. He did not move. He set the cleaning rod down on the table very gently, the way a man sets down a thing that might break if it heard a sudden noise, and he said in a voice she could only just hear, "Cass." The man by the fire turned around. She had been ready for many things in her 22 years. She had been ready for poverty after her father's debts came due. She had been ready for the cold loneliness of working as a governess in another woman's house. She had been ready even, babe, for the long, terrible journey west and the strange country at the end of it. She had not been ready for this. She had not been ready for three of them. She made a small sound in her throat that was not quite a word. The man by the fire took one step toward the foot of the ladder and then stopped deliberately and held up both his hands so that she could see the palms. "Miss Whitlock," he said, "my name is Cassius Thorne. I am the man who wrote you the letters." She could not speak. "The other two are my brothers," he said, "Jeremiah and Rourke. They are good men, and they are under my roof, and you are safe." Still she could not speak. "I owe you a truth," he went on in the same low, careful voice, never moving from where he stood. "I never told you about them in the letters. I should have. I let you believe my family was something other than what it is. That was a coward's choice, and I am sorry for it. You have every right to be angry. You have every right to be afraid. But you are not in any danger in this house. Not from me, not from them, not from anyone while we are alive." Della stood at the head of the ladder with one hand on the railing and looked down into the upturned faces of three strangers. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it. The man at the table, the one called Jeremiah, had set down the cleaning rod and folded his hands on the table where she could see them. The young one, Rourke, had taken off his hat and was holding it in front of him with both hands like a boy at a funeral. And Cassius Thorne, the man who had written her the letters, the man whose handwriting she had memorized over 6 months, the man she had crossed a continent to marry, stood by his fire with his palms turned out and his face as still and as braced as a man waiting for a blow. She thought about the letters. She thought about the third one in particular, The one in which he had written, "I am not a man who has had much practice at saying soft things, but I find myself wanting to learn on the chance that you might one day be willing to hear them." A man who wrote a sentence like that did not become a different man overnight. She took a slow breath. She took another. She came down the ladder one rung at a time, holding tight because her legs were not yet entirely her own. None of the three brothers moved while she did it. They stood like three carved figures, and they let her come down at her own speed. And when her bare feet in their borrowed moccasins finally touched the puncheon floor of the front room, the air went out of all three of them at once. She looked at Cass. Up close, he was taller than she had thought from the loft, and older, and his eyes were the color of strong honey held up to a window. There was a faint scar at the line of his jaw where a beard had grown over it. His hands were shaking very slightly in the air between them. "Mr. Thorne," she said. Her voice was not much more than a whisper, but it was steady. "You pulled me out of the snow." "Yes, ma'am." "How long was I out there?" "2 days, maybe a little more." "We don't know exactly." She nodded slowly as if filing this away. "And the wagon," she said. "The driver. The other men." Cass did not look away from her. "Gone, ma'am. All four of them. I am sorry." She closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, she looked past Cass at the other two, at Quiet Jem with his folded hands and at young Rourke with his hat. She looked at the room. She looked at the river stone fireplace and the shelves of plain crockery and the long pine table scrubbed white with sand and the rifle racks on the wall and the row of three coats on three pegs by the door. She looked at the small bookshelf in the corner, and she saw, even from across the room, that there were more than 30 books on it and that the spines had been read until they were soft. A man with 30 books on a shelf in a Wyoming cabin was not the kind of man who killed women. "Mr. Thorne," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "My name is Della. If we are going to be honest with one another in this house, then my name in this house is Della." Something in Cass's face moved. "Della," he said, "you said in your letter that you would not lie to me about anything." "I said it and I meant it, even when I was failing at it in the same letter." "Are you a good man, Cassius Thorne?" He thought about the question. He did not answer it quickly. That more than anything else was what decided her. "I try to be," he said at last. "Most days I think I succeed. Some days I know I don't. I keep my word. I work my land. I do not raise my hand to anything that cannot raise its hand back. Beyond that, I would not want to claim too much." Della nodded once. "All right," she said. The three brothers waited. "All right," she said again. "Then here is what we will do. I will stay until the spring because I cannot go anywhere before then anyway, and because the man who wrote me those letters has earned at least a winter of my time to prove himself. I will sleep in the loft. You will sleep wherever you usually sleep, Mr. Thorne, but not where I am until and unless I tell you otherwise. I will earn my keep. I do not eat for free, and I do not sit while other people work. Are these terms acceptable to you?" Cass had to clear his throat before he could answer. "Yes, Della, they are." "Then we are agreed." She held out her hand. He looked at it for a moment as if he were not sure what to do with it. Then he reached out and took it. His palm was the size of a small shovel, and it was rough as fence rail, and it was very warm. She felt the calluses of 20 years of honest work, and she felt a slight tremor in his fingers that he could not quite hide. "A man keeps his word, Della," he said. "I will hold you to that, Mr. Thorne." "Cass," he said. "Cass," she said. In the kitchen, Jeremiah turned his face away so that no one would see what was in it. Rourke was already smiling, the white, unguarded smile of the youngest brother, the smile of a boy who has just watched his older brother be saved from drowning. He bowed to Della from the waist, an absurd, courtly bow that he could not possibly have learned anywhere except from a book, and he said, "Miss Della, I will be sleeping in the barn tonight on account of the new arrangement, and I will count it the warmest barn I have ever slept in." She laughed. It was the first laugh that had been heard in the front room of the Thorn Ridge cabin in 12 years. None of the three brothers moved while it happened. They listened to it the way a man in a dry country listens to rain. That night, the wind came down hard off the Wind River Range and pressed against the cabin walls and tried to find a way in. It did not. The chinking held. The fire held. In the loft above the front room, Della Whitlock lay in a bed that smelled of cedar and wood smoke and slept the first deep, dreamless sleep she had slept in 6 months. Down in the kitchen, Jem sat up with the Sharps across his knees and watched the door. Out in the barn, wrapped in 2 blankets and his father's old wool coat, Cass lay on a bed of straw next to Bess's stall and stared up at the dark beams of the hayloft and tried to understand what had just happened to him. He had ridden out yesterday morning expecting to bury her. He had ridden home tonight with her alive in his arms. And then she had come down a ladder in his own house and looked him in the eye and made a bargain with him, as steady as any man he had ever traded horses with. And then she had laughed. He did not know yet that he loved her. He was not the kind of man who would have used the word that early. But he knew that something had happened to him that he was not going to be able to undo, and he knew that for the first time since the war, he was afraid of losing something he had not yet been allowed to keep. He thought about the 6 riders Rourke had cut sign on down in the canyon, 6 riders going southeast toward the Sweetwater, 6 riders who had killed 4 armed men in broad daylight and then ridden away, leaving the strongbox cracked and empty, and the woman they had come for buried, they thought, somewhere under the snow. When they found out she was not buried, they would come. Cass closed his eyes. Winter, he thought. We have until winter ends. 50 miles south of Thorn Ridge, in the back room of a roadhouse outside Cheyenne, a tall, thin man in a long gray coat sat at a plank table by a tallow lamp and turned a small object over in his fingers. It was a button. A small dark button covered in silk thread, the kind that came off the sleeve of a Boston traveling dress. He had found it in the snow beside an overturned wagon. He set the button down on the table in front of him very precisely in the center of a circle of yellow lamplight. She walked out, he said to no one in particular. His voice was soft and dry and entirely without warmth. She walked out of that canyon on her own 2 feet. Somebody picked her up. Somebody is keeping her warm tonight. He smiled in the way that a man like Ambrose Vance smiled, which was not really a smile at all. Find out who, he said. Up in the high country, in the loft above the front room of a cabin called Thorn Ridge, Della Whitlock slept on and did not yet know that the man who had murdered her future was 20 days behind her in closing. The first morning Della woke before the sun. She lay still in the loft and listened to the cabin breathe. Somewhere below her, a stove door opened and a small dry log was set into a bed of coals. A kettle was lifted and set down on. Boots crossed the puncheon floor without hurry. A man's voice, low and rough with sleep, said something she could not quite catch, and another voice answered, and then there was the soft creak of the front door and the rush of cold air in the door closing again. She got up. She washed her face in the basin Jem had left and put on the plainest of the 2 dresses in her carpet bag, the gray wool one with the white collar, the dress she had meant to wear when she met her husband for the first time. She braided her hair the way she had braided it every morning of her life since she was 9 years old. She put on the rabbit fur moccasins, and she went down the ladder. Jem was at the stove. He looked up when she came down, and his face did the small, careful thing it did instead of a smile. He had a coffee pot in one hand and a tin cup in the other, and he held the cup out toward her without speaking, the way a man offers a drink of water to a horse he is still trying to make friends with. Thank you, Della said. She took the cup. The coffee inside it was black and strong and very hot, and there was a small amount of honey already stirred into it, which she had not asked for and which she had not known she wanted until she tasted it. There's biscuit in the warming oven, Jem said. Where are the others? Cass is at the woodpile. Rourke went out before light to check the trap line on the creek. She looked around the front room of the cabin in the gray morning light, and she saw it differently than she had seen it the night before. The night before, it had been a room with 3 strangers in it. This morning, it was a room, just a room, a long pine table scrubbed white, A river stone hearth with a fire laid the right way and burning clean. A row of 3 coats on 3 pegs and 3 rifles on 3 nails and 3 pairs of boots underneath. 3 of everything. She had never in her life been in a household where everything came in threes. She drank her coffee standing by the stove. "Mr. Thorne," she said. Jem, may I help with breakfast?" Jem looked at her for a long moment. He looked at her the way a man looks at a question he was not expecting to be asked. Then he nodded once and stepped sideways to make room at the stove, and he handed her a wooden spoon and pointed to a covered crock on the back of the range. And Della Whitlock, who had once served tea on bone china to the wife of a Boston banker, lifted the lid off a crock of cornmeal mush and went to work. That was the first morning. The mornings that followed went the same way, and then they began to go a little differently, the way water finds its channel by running over the same ground again and again until the ground remembers it. By the third morning, Della knew where the salt was kept, and where the lard was kept, and where the dried apples from last fall were kept in a cloth bag hanging from a ceiling beam to keep the mice off them. By the fifth morning, she had learned that Cass took his coffee black, and Jem took his with honey, and Rourke took his with 3 spoons of brown sugar, and a stare that dared anyone to comment on it. By the seventh morning, she was the one who built the fire in the kitchen stove before any of the brothers came down, because she had decided that if she was going to eat their food and sleep under their roof, she was going to be the first one out of bed, and a Boston governess does not lose an argument with herself about a thing like that. On the eighth morning, Cass came in from the front room, having slept the night before on the bench by the fire, because the temperature in the barn had dropped past the point where any sane man would call it a place to sleep, and he stopped at the kitchen doorway and stared. The kitchen was warm. The coffee was made. There was bacon in the pan. There were biscuits in the warming oven. There was a small jar of wildflowers' dry stalks from last summer that she had found in a tin in the pantry, set in the middle of the table where no flowers had ever been set in the 12 years since their mother had died. Della was standing at the window with a dish towel over her shoulder, watching the light come up over the Wind River Range. She turned when she heard him. "Good morning, Gus. Good morning, Della." He could not think of anything else to say. He stood there in his stocking feet with his suspenders down around his hips and his hair flat on one side from the pillow. And he looked at the small jar of dry flowers on his father's table, and he could not say one word. She took down a plate and put 2 biscuits on it and a piece of bacon and a spoon of mush, and she set it at his place at the head of the table. "Sit down," she said. "Eat." He sat down. He ate. The snow came in earnest in the second week. It came down slowly at first, a lazy curtain of small, dry flakes that did not seem in any hurry to reach the ground. And then it came harder, and then in the night the wind got up and took hold of the snow and made it into something else. By the morning of the third day, Della could not see the barn from the kitchen window. The world had gone white in every direction, and the cabin had become an island in a sea of nothing, and the only sounds in the world were the wind and the fire and the breathing of 3 men and 1 woman who had nowhere to go and nothing to do but learn each other. She learned them. Jem first, because Jem was the easiest. Jem did not need to be talked to. Jem could sit at the table for an hour cleaning a rifle while she kneaded bread on the other end of the same table, and the silence between them would not feel like silence at all, but like a third presence in the room that both of them were comfortable with. On the 4th day of the storm, she found him in the front room, mending a tear in his coat with a needle that was much too coarse for the cloth, and she sat down across from him without a word and held out her hand for the coat. He gave it to her. She mended it the way her mother had taught her, with small, invisible stitches, and she handed it back, and Jem looked at the sun for a long time before he looked at her. "That is a kindness," he said. "It is a coat," she said. "Coats want mending. There is no kindness involved." But there was, and they both knew it, and that night after supper, Jem brought down a fiddle from a shelf in the loft she had not noticed before. It was an old fiddle, the varnish worn through in places where his chin and his hand had lived against it for years, and he tuned it slowly by the fire while Cass and Rourke pretended not to be watching her watch him. He played a slow Scots air that she had not heard since her mother's funeral. Della Whitlock sat very still in her chair by the fire and listened, and somewhere in the second verse, her hands forgot to hold each other and went loose in her lap, and a single tear went down the side of her nose and fell on the wool of her dress and made a small dark spot there, and she did not bother to wipe it away. When the song ended, Jem set the fiddle down without looking at her. "My mother used to sing that one," he said quietly. "She was from Glasgow before she came west." "Mine too," Della said. "Boston, but her people were Galway. She used to sing the second verse different than you played it." "Sing it for me sometime?" "Maybe I will." Cass, sitting on the other side of the fire with his hands folded over a book he had stopped reading 3 minutes ago, did not say a word. He only watched her face in the firelight, and he thought without meaning to think it, "You are home now." He did not say it out loud. He was not ready, and he did not think she was either. Rourke was harder to learn than Jem. Rourke was easier to talk to and harder to learn, which Della found in herself to be true of a great many young men. He talked all the time. He talked while he was eating and while he was working and while he was supposed to be listening, and most of what he said was either a story or a joke or an opinion about something he had no business having an opinion about, and Della enjoyed all of it more than she expected to. He reminded her of a younger brother she had never had. On the sixth day of the storm, he came in from the barn with snow up to his knees and a strange light in his eyes and asked her if she could shoot. "No," she said. "Would you like to learn?" "Yes," she said without thinking about it, and surprised herself. He took her out to the lean-to behind the cabin where the wind was less, and he set up 3 tin cans on a rail at 20 paces, and he put a small revolver in her hand. It was a Colt pocket model, much smaller than the heavy thing he carried at his own hip, and he had clearly been keeping it somewhere for some purpose he had not yet announced. "This was my mother's," he said. "Father gave it to her the year they came up here. She could put 5 out of 6 into a playing card at 30 paces. I never could get past 4 myself. But she had hands like yours, small, quick. Don't grip it like a hammer. Hold it like you hold a teacup that you do not want to spill." Della held it like a teacup that she did not want to spill. She missed the first can. She missed the second can. She hit the third can dead center, and the can went spinning off the rail, and Rourke let out a whoop that startled 3 crows out of a pine tree 50 yards away. "Della Whitlock," he said, "you are a natural. I am a Boston governess who has just shot a tin can." "Same thing? The mountain doesn't lie about a thing like that." She turned the phrase over in her head. The mountain doesn't lie. She liked it. She did not yet know that he said it about everything and that by April she would be saying it back to him. She practiced every day after that in the lean-to in any weather. By the end of the second week, she could put 4 out of 6 into a tin can at 20 paces. By the end of the third week, she could put 5 out of 6. Cass watched her sometimes from the kitchen window with a look on his face that Jem caught once and chose not to comment on. Cass was the hardest of the 3 to learn. Cass did not play the fiddle, and Cass did not tell jokes, and Cass did not teach her to shoot. Cass cut wood and tended the stock and oiled harness and read books in the evening, and when she spoke to him directly, his answers were short and his eyes did not stay on her face for very long. For the first 10 days of the storm, she was not sure he liked having her in the cabin at all. Then on the 11th day, she found the cup. She came down the loft ladder one morning, and there was a tin cup of hot coffee sitting on the small crate by the foot of the ladder just inside the front room, where she would see it the moment her bare feet touched the floor. There was a small wedge of honeycomb on a chip of pine bark next to it. There was no note. There was no one in the front room when she came down. She looked at the cup for a long moment. Then she looked at the door, which was just closing on a draft of cold air, as if someone had stepped outside in a hurry. She picked up the cup. The coffee inside it was the exact temperature of coffee that a man has carried carefully across a room and set down 2 minutes before the woman it is meant for is expected to come down a ladder. She went to the kitchen window. Cass was at the wood pile. He was splitting kindling with a small axe, his back to the cabin, his shoulders working in the slow, even rhythm of a man who had been splitting wood since he was 9 years old. He did not look up. The next morning, the cup was there again, and the morning after that. On the 14th morning, she came down the ladder 5 minutes earlier than usual, and she caught him. He was standing at the foot of the ladder with the cup in his hand, and he had clearly just set it down and turned to leave. And he froze when he saw her bare feet coming down the rungs. And the look on his face was the look of a man who had been caught doing something much worse than bringing a woman a cup of coffee. "Cass," she said. "Della, how long have you been doing this?" He thought about lying. She watched him think about it. Then he set the cup down very carefully on the crate and straightened up and looked at her. "Since the third morning," he said. "Why, I got say, because the loft is cold in the morning, and I did not want you to come down to a cold room and have nothing in your hands." She looked at him. He looked back. It was the longest either of them had looked at the other since the morning she came down the ladder for the first time. Outside, the storm had eased a little, and a thin gray light was coming in through the kitchen window and falling on the side of his face and showing her the small scar at his jaw and the hollow under his cheekbone and the place where his beard was beginning to go gray at the corner of his mouth, even though he was only 33 years old. "Thank you, Cass," she said. "You are welcome, Tella." That was all either of them said. But when she sat down at the table that morning to drink her coffee, she sat at the place beside his place instead of across from him, as she had been doing, and Cass came in from the wood pile 10 minutes later and saw where she had put her cup and stopped in the doorway with his hat in his hand and did not move for a full breath. Then he walked very quietly to the table and sat down beside her and ate his breakfast without saying one word. And Jem and Rourke, watching from the kitchen, exchanged a glance that neither of them could have explained out loud. The dream came on the 15th night. She had not had it since the night of the wagon. She had thought in the warmth and the safety of the cabin that the cold and the exhaustion had burned it out of her. She had been wrong. In the dream, she was back in the canyon. The wagon was on its side, and the canvas was flapping in the wind like a torn sail. And the four bodies were lying in the snow exactly as she had not quite seen them through the cracked side panel, exactly as she had imagined them every night for 2 days while she crawled and fell and crawled and fell. And then the dream did the thing it always did, the thing that was not memory, but something worse than memory, the thing where the bodies in the snow began to sit up. She woke screaming. She woke with her hands clutching the wool blanket against her chest and her heart hammering and a thin film of cold sweat on her forehead, and she did not know for one terrible second where she was. Then she heard boots on the ladder fast 2 at a time, and she had time to think the rifle, where's the rifle? And then Cass was up through the hatch and across the loft and on his knees beside her bed. He did not touch her. He had the sense, even in the half-dark with his hair wild from sleep, not to touch her. "Della," he said, "Della, you're in the cabin, you're in the loft. It's me, it's Cass, you're safe." She was shaking so hard the bed was shaking with her. "They will find me," she said. The words came out before she could stop them. "He will not stop. He will never stop. He will come up here and he will kill all of you, and it will be because of me." Cass went very still. "Who, Della?" She closed her mouth. "Della, who?" But she had already turned her face away and pulled the blanket up over her shoulder and curled in on herself the way she had curled in the rocks above the canyon, and she would not say another word. After a long moment, Cass got slowly to his feet. He went to the small crate by the bed and poured a cup of water from the pitcher and set it where her hand could reach it. He pulled the second blanket up over her. He stood there in the dark and looked down at her. "All right," he said quietly. "All right, Della, you don't have to tell me tonight, but I am going to tell you something, and I want you to hear it even if you don't answer me. Whatever it is you are running from, it will not get through this door. Not while there is breath in any of us. Do you hear me?" She did not answer, but under the blanket, very slightly, she nodded. Cass climbed back down the ladder. Jem and Rourke were both standing in the front room with rifles in their hands. Jem had lit the lamp on the table. Rourke was already half-dressed. Bad dream, Cass said. I heard, Jem said. There is somebody back east. She would not say a name, but there is somebody. Rourke set the rifle down on the table and ran his hand back through his hair and let out a long, slow breath. Cass, he said, I know. That is the thing that murdered 4 men in a canyon and then rode away knowing it had done a job. I know Rourke. Then we need to start sleeping in shifts. We start tonight, Cass said. The storm broke on the 17th day. They woke to a silence that was almost loud after so many days of wind. Della came down the ladder in her gray dress and stopped halfway and listened because she could not at first identify what she was hearing. Then she understood. She was hearing nothing. The wind had stopped. The world outside the cabin was holding its breath. Cass opened the front door, and a wedge of blinding white light came in and laid itself across the puncheon floor. And the 4 of them stood at the door together and looked out at a country none of them entirely recognized. The snow had drifted as high as the eaves on the north side of the barn. The lodge poles down by the creek were bent double under it. The sky above was a blue so pure it hurt to look at, and the sun on the snow was the kind of light that could blind a man inside of an hour if he was not careful. I need to go to Pinedale, Cass said. Cass, we are out of coffee, Jem, and out of sugar, and the salt is low, and we need to know what the country is doing. Then I will go with you. No, you and Rourke stay here. I will take Della. Rourke turned his head sharply. You will take her into town. I will take her where I can keep my eyes on her, and she can see another woman's face for the first time in a month, because if I leave her in this cabin 1 more week without letting her see another woman, she will start to believe she dreamed the rest of the world. And I will take her on Bess, and I will not let her out of my sight for 1 second, and we will be back before dark. Della, standing in the doorway with the cold air of the broken storm on her face, said yes. That was the only word she said, but it settled the matter. They rode out the next morning at first light. Pinedale was a small town in those years, 12 buildings strung along one rutted street with a livery and a general store and a saloon and a small white church and a blacksmith and not much else. Cass rode Bess and Della sat in front of him because there was only the one good saddle for the kind of snow they had to cross, and for the first hour she sat very stiff and proper with her hands folded in her lap. By the second hour, the cold had got into her enough that she let her shoulders ease back against his chest, and by the third hour, she was almost asleep, with her cheek against the front of his coat, and Cass rode the last 5 miles into Pinedale, moving as little as a man can move on a horse, because he was afraid that any small motion would wake her up and put the distance back between them. They tied up at the general store. The bell over the door rang, and a woman behind the counter looked up, and when she saw Della, her whole face changed. Well now, said Winifred Calloway, who had run the Pinedale General Store for 19 years and had outlived 2 husbands and 3 winters that should have killed her. Well now, Cass Thorne, what in the everlasting name of glory have you brought into my shop? Winnie, Cass said, this is Miss Della Whitlock. She came up from Boston to marry me. There was trouble on the road, and she lost her party, and I am bringing her around so the women in this town can see her face and know she is real and not catch me out in a lie 3 months from now. Winnie Calloway came around the counter so fast her apron strings flew, and she took Della Whitlock by both hands and looked her up and down, and then pulled her into a hug that smelled of lavender soap and cinnamon and the warm, dry wood of a country store in winter. And Della, who had not been hugged by another woman since her own mother's funeral 9 years ago, made a small sound into Winnie's shoulder that she would never afterward admit to having made. Cass turned away to look at the harness on the wall. He looked at the harness for a long time, and when he turned back, his eyes were not entirely dry, and he hoped Winnie did not notice. Winnie noticed everything. Winnie chose not to mention it. You sit, Winnie told Della, steering her toward a chair by the wood stove. You sit right there. I am going to make you a cup of tea that has actual tea leaves in it, not whatever those Thorne boys are boiling for you up at that cabin, and you are going to drink it, and you are going to tell me everything about Boston that I have not heard in 19 years. And Cass Thorne, You are going to do your shopping like a grown man and not bother us. Yes, ma'am, Cass said. He gathered the supplies, coffee, sugar, a small tin of real China tea, which he set on the counter without comment, and which Winnie saw and did not comment on either. A bolt of soft blue calico that he had not come in for, and which he stood looking at for a full minute before he laid it on the counter beside the rest. 2 pounds of dried apricots, a new tin of stove blacking, a small jar of rose water that he hid under the calico. While he was doing this, Rourke was in the saloon 2 doors down. Rourke had ridden in behind them an hour later against orders because Rourke had decided on his own that one thorn in town was not enough thorn in town, and he had tied his horse at the saloon rail because the saloon was the place in any small town where a man heard the things he needed to hear. He ordered a whiskey he did not drink and sat at the end of the bar with his hat pulled low. 2 men were at a table by the window. They were strangers. They were not dressed for the country. One of them was talking, and the other was listening. And the one who was talking had a soft, dry voice that did not carry well, but Rourke had ears like a hunting dog, and he had been training this morning conversations like this one his whole life. Boston dress, the soft voice was saying. Dark blue, honey hair, 22 years of age, traveling under the name Whitlock, but we do not know if that is the name she is using now. The other man said something Rourke could not catch. No, said the soft voice. Live. We are quite certain of that now. The wagon was found, and the bodies were counted, and the count was one short. She walked out of that canyon. Somebody picked her up. We are going to find out who, and we are going to pay them a visit, and then we are going to take her home, though. Rourke sat very still at the end of the bar with his whiskey untouched in front of him. He turned his head slowly, just enough to see them out of the corner of his eye. The one who was talking was tall and thin and wore a long gray coat and had eyes the color of pond ice in November. The other was a heavier man with a flat face and a gun belt that he wore the way men who use guns wear them. The thin man looked up. For 1 second, his pale eyes met Rourke's across the room. Rourke yawned and stretched and dropped a coin on the bar and walked out of the saloon at the unhurried pace of a young rancher who has had one drink too many for the middle of the day, and the moment the door closed behind him, he ran. He came into the general store like a wind. Cass. Cass turned with the bolt of blue calico still in his hand. Rourke did not say anything in front of Winnie or Della. He only looked at Cass, and Cass, who had known his youngest brother for 29 years, set the calico down on the counter very slowly and said in a voice that was almost normal, Winnie, we are going to need to leave. I am going to come back next week and finish this. Put the calico aside for me. Cass Thorne, what in the world? Next week, Winnie, I promise. Della was already on her feet. She had read his face the way she had been learning to read it for 2 weeks, and she had her cloak in her hands before he had to ask her for it. They were on the horses inside of 3 minutes. Rourke rode his black, hard out ahead. Cass put Della up in front of him on Bess and wrapped one arm around her waist in a way that was no longer about cold and was now about something else entirely, and they rode out of Pinedale at a pace that left a thin streamer of powder snow rising in their wake. Della did not ask. She waited. 5 miles out of town, when they had left the last of the houses well behind, and the country had opened up into the long white flats that ran north toward the foothills, Cass leaned his head down close to her ear and spoke so that only she could hear. There are men in the saloon, he said, 2 of them. The one who is doing the talking is a tall, thin man in a gray coat, with eyes the color of pond ice. He is asking after a woman in a Boston traveling dress. He knows you are alive. He does not yet know where you are. Della went very still in his arms. Della. Yes. Who is he? She closed her eyes against the wind. The snow was bright and the sun was very high and the country was weedy and white and unforgiving in every direction, and she was warm only in the half circle of his arm. His name, she said quietly, is Vance. I believe his name is Vance. I was a governess to a family in Boston. The eldest son developed an attachment to me that I did not return. When I refused him, he threatened to ruin my name. I answered Mr. Thorne's advertisement 4 days later. I did not think they would follow me. I did not think anyone would care enough to follow me this far. Della. Yes, Cass. Whatever they think they are owed, whatever they think they came here to take back, they are not going to get it. Do you hear me? They are not going to get 1 inch of you, not while I am alive, not while either of my brothers is alive. She turned her face into the front of his coat. A man keeps his word, she said into the wool. A man keeps his word, Cass said back to her. They rode the last 12 miles to Thorn Ridge in silence. The sun was low when they came up out of the last draw and saw the cabin. Smoke was coming out of the chimney in a thin straight line, and Jem was at the door with the sharps in his hand, because Jem had a way of knowing things, and the moment he saw 3 riders coming up the trail at the pace they were coming, he had taken the rifle off the wall. Rourke went straight to the barn. Cass swung Della down from the saddle and held onto her elbow longer than he needed to and walked her to the door. Jem stepped aside to let them in, and his eyes met Cass's eyes, and the question in Jem's face was answered before any of them said a word. "Bar the door," Cass said. "From tonight on the door stays barred after sundown. Rourke takes the first watch, I take the second, Jem takes the third. Della does not go to the well alone. Della does not go to the woodpile alone. Della does not go anywhere alone. We are going to start teaching her where the rifles live in this house and which floorboard in the kitchen lifts up and how to drop down through it without making a sound. We are going to start tonight." "All right, Cass." Cass turned to Della. She was standing in the middle of the front room with the cold of the ride still on her cheeks and her hair coming loose from its braid and her hands very still at her sides, and she was looking at him with an expression he had never seen on a woman's face before and might never see on a woman's face again. It was not fear, it was the look of a person who has spent her whole life being told to run and has just decided in the warm yellow light of a stranger's cabin that she is finished running. "Cass Thorne," she said. "Yes, Della." "Teach me where the rifles live." Outside, the sun went down behind the Wind River Range, and the long shadow of the mountain came across the cabin and across the barn and across the long white country and somewhere south of Pinedale. In the back room of a roadhouse, a tall, thin man in a gray coat set down a coffee cup and smiled at nothing and said very softly to the heavy man across the table, "I think we are very close now." The lesson started that night. Cass took Della from one end of the cabin to the other, and at every wall and every window and every door he stopped and showed her something. The Henry rifle that lived on 2 pegs above the front door. The old sharps that lived on the kitchen wall behind the salt crock. The short double barrel that lived in the bottom drawer of the pine sideboard where a woman could reach it without bending all the way down. The cap and ball revolver that lived under a folded shirt on the 3rd shelf of the corner cupboard. He showed her each one. He showed her how to lift it down without rattling, how to check the loads, how to set it back the way she had found it, so that anyone who came looking for it later would know nothing had been moved. "This one stays loaded," he said of the short double barrel. "Always both barrels. Buckshot. If anyone comes through that door who is not me or Jem or Rourke, you do not ask questions and you do not call out. You point this at the middle of his chest and you pull both triggers and you do not stop to see what happens after." "All right, Cass. Do you understand me, Della?" "I understand you." He looked at her for a long moment in the lamplight. Then he took her by the elbow and walked her to the kitchen, and he knelt down on the puncheon floor, and he laid his palm flat against a board near the corner of the stove, and he pressed in a particular way with the heel of his hand, and the board lifted clean out of the floor. Della stared. "My father built this," Cass said quietly, "the summer after we came west. He built it in case the Sioux came down the valley one bad winter, which they never did. He built it for our mother. There is a crawl space under the cabin. It runs from here to the back wall and out under the porch. A grown man cannot use it. A grown woman can. There is a lantern down there, and a tin of matches and an oilcloth and a wool blanket and a small water jug, and you do not need to tell anyone it is there. You only need to know that it is there. She knelt down beside him in the lamplight and looked into the dark square of the crawl space, and she could smell the dry, cold smell of bare earth that had not seen the sun since the year their father died. "Why are you showing me this?" she said. "Cass, why now?" He did not answer her at first. He set the board carefully back into its place and pressed it flat with his hand and stood up, and he held his hand down to her and pulled her to her feet, and he kept holding her hand for a moment longer than the standing up required. "Because I would rather show you a thing you never need," he said, "than need a thing I never showed you." Della Whitlock looked up into his face in the lamplight. She had been looking at his face for nearly a month now. She knew the small scar at his jaw and the place where his beard was beginning to gray and the way his right eye narrowed a little before he was about to say something he had thought hard about. She knew the warm color of his eyes in firelight. What she did not know until that moment in the kitchen with the trap door at her feet was that she could love this man. That she did love this man. That somewhere between the cup of coffee on the third morning and the bolt of blue calico in Winifred Calloway's store, the thing she had crossed a continent to find by chance had already been found and was standing in front of her, holding her hand. She did not say it. There was not yet a place inside her brave enough to say it out loud. But she squeezed his hand once briefly, the way a person squeezes a hand to say, "I am here." And Cass Thorne, who had not been told he was loved by any woman since his mother's last fevered week in the spring of '66, felt a small pressure of her fingers and went very still. "Della," he said. "Show me where the lantern is," she said. "If it is going to be down there for me, I want to know which corner to find it in." He showed her. That was the way it was in those days. Neither of them said the large word. They said small things instead, and the small things did the work of the large word. And at night, Della went up the loft ladder to her bed under the roof, and Cass slept on the bench in the front room with the Henry across his knees, and the cabin held its breath and waited. The watches began. Rourke took the first 3 hours after dark. He sat on the bench by the front door with his Winchester and a tin cup of coffee that he kept just out of arm's reach on purpose, so that every time he wanted a sip, he had to stand up and move and shake the sleep out of his legs. Jem took the long middle. Cass took the cold gray hours from 3 to dawn, which were the hardest. They did this for 4 nights, and then 5, and then 6, and on the 7th night, Della came down the ladder at midnight in her gray wool dress, with her hair braided down her back, and she sat down across the table from Jem and said, "Teach me how to load the sharps." "Della, Jeremiah Thorne, if a man comes through that door at 3 in the morning, I am not going to be useful to anyone holding a buckshot gun and shaking. Teach me how to load the rifle so that if I have to put a fresh round into it for one of you, I will not fumble it." Jem looked at her for a long moment over the top of the lamp. Then he reached behind him and took the sharps off its pegs, and he laid it on the table between them, and he said, "All right, this is the breech. This is the lever. This is how the falling block works. You watch." She watched. She did not go back up to the loft until dawn. Outside, the country was beginning its long, slow turn. The deepest of the cold had come and gone, and the sun, when it came up a little earlier each morning and stayed a little longer each evening. The drifts on the north side of the barn began to firm and crust at night and soften by midday. There was a single afternoon in the third week of February when the south wind came up off the lower valleys and the eaves dripped for 2 hours, and then the cold came back, but the dripping had been there, and all 4 of them had heard it, and none of them said it, but all of them thought it. Spring was coming. Spring was coming, and with it, the thaw. And with the thaw, the trails would open, and on the open trails, the men in the gray coats would come up the canyon. Everyone in the cabin understood this. Nobody said it. The almost touch came on the night of the fiddle. It was an evening in the last week of February. The wind was down and the sky outside was black and full of stars, and Jem had taken the fiddle down off the shelf in the loft after supper without being asked. He played a slow reel first, and then a slow air, and then very softly the same Scott song he had played the first night, the one Della's mother had once sung at her own kitchen table in Boston. This time Della sang. She did not stand up to do it. She sat in her chair by the fire with her hands folded in her lap, and she sang the second verse in the soft, true alto that had been her mother's voice before it was hers. And the cabin went so quiet that the only other sound in it was the small click of the fire eating itself and the drawn-out singing of Jem's bow on the strings. When she stopped, Rourke wiped his eyes with the back of his sleeve and pretended he had not. Jem set the fiddle down on his knee and looked at the floor. Cass stood up slowly from his chair across the fire and walked to the hearth and put another log on, even though the fire did not need another log. And when he turned back from the fire, his face was the face of a man who had been struck a soft blow and had not yet decided whether to fall down. "Della," he said, "yes. My mother used to say that a song in a house was the only thing that made the house hold still and listen to itself. Mine used to say almost the same thing." He crossed the room and stopped in front of her chair. He did not sit down. He stood there with his hands at his sides and looked down at her, and Jem and Rourke, with great delicacy, became very interested in the fiddle case and the fire respectively. "You are home now, Della," Cass said. It was the first time he had said it in plain words in front of his brothers, in front of God, in the warm yellow light of his own front room. He did not say, "I love you." He said the other thing, the thing that meant the same thing in this country and in this house and in his particular way of being a man. Della Whitlock looked up at him. She reached out slowly and laid her right hand on top of his right hand, where it hung at his side, and she did not curl her fingers around his, and he did not curl his around hers. They only stood there with the back of her hand against the back of his, the smallest possible touch, and they looked at each other in the firelight, and the cabin held its breath. Then she let go. "Good night, Cass," she said. "Good night, Della." She went up the loft ladder. She did not look back. Cass stood by the fire for a long time after the trap door at the top of the ladder closed, and Jem at last got up and put the fiddle away without speaking, and Rourke poured the last of the coffee and handed it to his oldest brother and clapped him once on the shoulder and went out to the barn to begin his watch. The first attack came 2 nights later. It was an hour past midnight. Rourke had handed the watch off to Jem and gone out to sleep in the barn. The fire in the front room was banked low. Cass was asleep on the bench under a wool blanket with the Henry within reach. Jem was at the kitchen table with the sharps across his knees and a tin cup of coffee gone cold an hour ago. Bess hollered from the barn. It was not a small whicker. It was the high, hard scream a horse makes when something is in the barn that has no business being there, and it cut through the cold air like a thrown knife. Jem was on his feet before the second sound came. The second sound was a man's shout from the dooryard abruptly cut off, and then the flat, hard crack of a rifle, and then another. Cass was already up. The blanket fell away. He had the Henry in his hands, and he was at the front shutter, with his eye to the slit in the cold gray night beyond it. "Della," he said. "Loft." No. But Della was already coming down the ladder. She came down in her gray dress with her hair loose down her back and the small Colt pocket revolver in her right hand, and she did not look afraid, and Cass did not have time to be either proud of her or terrified for her, because there was a heavy thud at the front door and a man's voice cursed in the dark outside, and a second shot rang out from the direction of the barn. "Rourke is up," Jem said grimly. "Rourke is up and shooting. They came in through the back of the barn, Cass. They came in through the back." "How many?" "I count 3 muzzle flashes. There may be more." A flaming bundle of rags came through the kitchen window in a shatter of glass and frost. It landed on the puncheon floor by the foot of the table, and the dry pine boards caught at once. Della did not scream. Delia did the thing Jem had taught her in the second week of the storm, the thing they had drilled together one slow afternoon by the kitchen stove, the thing she had not believed at the time she would ever need. She grabbed the heavy wool horse blanket from the back of the kitchen chair, and she threw it flat over the burning rags, and she stamped it down with her boot heel until the fire underneath went out with a hiss. When she straightened up, there was a smear of soot on her cheek, and her eyes were wide and very calm. Loft, Cass said again in a voice that was no longer asking. No. Della, I am loading the rifles, Cass. You and Jem are doing the shooting, and I am loading the rifles. That is the agreement. There was no time to argue. There was a heavy weight against the front door from outside, and the bar shuddered in its brackets, and Cass turned away from the shutter and aimed the Henry at the middle of the door, at the height of a man's chest, and put 2 rounds straight through the wood. The weight on the other side fell away. Outside in the dark, a man cried out and then was silent. For a long second after the Henry's roar, there was nothing in the cabin but the smell of black powder and burning wool, and the small sound of Della's hands feeding fresh cartridges into the side gate of the rifle that Jem had set on the table for her. Then there was another shot from the direction of the barn, and another, and then a long silence. And then Rourke's voice, ragged but alive, came from somewhere out in the dooryard. Cass. Rourke. 2 down out here. The third one is running for the trees. I can take him, but I do not have a clear angle from where I am. Let him go, Cass shouted back through the shutter. Let him go, and let him tell the man in the gray coat what happened tonight. Let him ride all the way back to Pinedale, and let him say it out loud so everyone in the saloon can hear it. There are 3 Thorne brothers and a woman in that cabin, and they do not go down easy. Out in the dark, Rourke laughed once, wild and short and full of teeth. Yes, sir. It took 20 minutes after that for any of them to be sure it was over. Cass and Jem went out together with the rifles. They found the 2 men Rourke had shot lying in the snow on the north side of the barn, and they found the 3rd man Cass had shot through the front door, lying with his back against the porch step with a look of vague surprise on his dead face. Neither of the dead men was Vance. Rourke had taken a graze across the side of his head from a pistol ball that had come close enough to part his hair, and not much closer than that, and he was still bleeding when he came back into the cabin, and he was grinning. Della Whitlock, he said, sitting down hard on the kitchen bench and letting Jem, who had come out of the kitchen with a clean cloth from the dish drawer, press it to the side of his head. Della Whitlock, you are the toughest woman I have ever met in my life, and I am including my mother in that statement. Hold still, Rourke. Yes, ma'am. There was a knife in the front door when they came back inside. It had been driven into the wood from the outside between the 2 bullet holes Cass's Henry had made, and it pinned a square of paper to the boards. Cass took the knife out and read the paper by lamplight. Then he handed the paper to Jem without a word, and Jem read it and handed it to Della, and Della stood by the kitchen stove with the soot still on her cheek and read it twice. The note was written in a thin, precise hand. By dawn, 3 days from now, deliver the woman to the trading post at South Pass. Alone, unharmed. We will not knock a second time. Vance. Della folded the paper in half and laid it on the table. 3 days, she said. 3 days, Cass said. She looked up at him. Her eyes in the lamplight were the color of cornflowers, and her mouth was set in a way Cass had not seen on her face before. And he understood, looking at her, that the thing the canyon had not killed, and the cold had not killed, and the long winter had not killed, had finally finished setting itself in her, like a bone that is knit harder where it was broken. They are not coming to that trading post, Della said quietly. Are they? No, Della. They are coming here. Good, she said. That was all she said. But Cass remembered it after the way a man remembers the moment a horse he has been gentling for 6 months finally walks into the barn of his own accord and lets the door close behind it. They did not sleep that night. They sat around the kitchen table in the lamplight, all four of them, with the rifles within reach and the wind beginning to come back up outside, and they planned. Rourke would take the loft window with the sharps. From the loft, he could cover the whole north approach across the open snow. Jem would take the kitchen window with the Henry. From the kitchen, he could cover the back of the cabin and the line of trees down by the creek where a careful man would come in low and slow. Cass would take the front door. He had built that door himself. He knew which side it would break on first if a man tried to come through it, and he knew where to stand so that the breaking would not catch him in the chest. Della would not be in the crawl space. They had agreed on that without even needing to vote. Della would be in the kitchen behind the heavy pine sideboard, where the angle of the wall protected her from any shot through the front door or the back, and she would have the short double barrel and a row of fresh cartridges laid out for the rifles, and she would load and pass while the brothers fired, and if any man got past the brothers and through the kitchen doorway, she would put both barrels of the buckshot into his chest at 6 paces, and she would not stop to see what happened after. "We are agreed," Cass said. "We are agreed," said Jem and Rourke. "We are agreed," said Della Whitlock. Cass reached across the table and took her hand. It was the first time he had taken her hand in front of his brothers, and neither of them looked away or pretended not to see. "Della, yes. I want you to know one thing. Whatever comes up that trail in 3 days, whatever we have to do to send it back down again. The day after that, I am going into Pinedale, and I am going to find the preacher, and I am going to bring him up here, and I am going to ask you a question. I should have asked you the night you came down that ladder for the first time. I should not have waited. I am not going to wait any longer than I have to." Della looked at him across the lamplight. "Cass Thorne, yes. I would have said yes the night I came down that ladder." There was a small, soft sound from Rourke that might have been a laugh, or might have been a man clearing his throat to keep from doing something undignified, and Jem reached across the table and very quietly poured fresh coffee into all 4 cups, and outside the wind picked up the loose snow off the porch and threw it against the shutters and went on past, and the lamp burned on, and the 4 people in the cabin sat together in a kind of quiet that none of them had ever sat in before. The third night came. The wind dropped at sundown the way the wind sometimes does before bad weather, and the way it sometimes does before nothing at all. The sky over the Wind River Range went the color of an old bruise, and then the color of slate, and then black, and the stars came out one at a time, and then all at once. Rourke went up to the loft with the sharps and a tin of cartridges and a wool blanket. Jem took his place at the kitchen window with the Henry across his knees. Cass barred the front door from inside and laid the second Henry on the bench beside it and stood with his back against the wall where the door would not catch him if it broke inward. Della was in the kitchen. She had taken off her gray wool dress and put on the rough work skirt and the heavy boots, and she had braided her hair tight against her head and pinned it flat. The short double barrel lay across her lap. The row of cartridges was laid out on the cloth beside her in the order Jem had taught her to lay them. There was a tin cup of water at her elbow because Jem had told her very quietly the day before that fear made a person's mouth go dry, and a dry mouth made a person breathe wrong, and breathing wrong made a person miss. She was not afraid. She had thought she would be. She had thought all through the long planning night 3 days ago, and all through the slow waiting day before this one, that when the hour came, her hands would shake and her knees would not hold her, and the cold things she had carried in her chest since Boston would come back up into her throat and choke her. None of those things happened. What she felt instead, sitting behind the pine sideboard in the lamp-low kitchen of a cabin in the Wyoming high country, was something she did not have a name for. It was the opposite of running. It was the opposite of hiding under an overhang of rock and waiting to die. It was the feeling of being for the first time in her 22 years exactly where she meant to be. She heard Cass's voice from the front room very low. "Della." "Yes, Cass. Whatever happens tonight." "I know, Cass. I have loved you," he said quietly through the open kitchen doorway, in the small last quiet before everything began. "Since the morning you came down that ladder, and made a bargain with me with your bare feet on my floor. I know, Cass. I just wanted you to have heard it once. I have heard it now. Out beyond the cabin in the dark on the far side of the open snow, something moved. Bess in the barn lifted her head and did not whicker. She had learned in 11 years of living with three Thorn brothers when not to whicker. Up in the loft, Rourke saw the small dark shape part company from the line of pines and slide forward across the open white, and he laid his cheek against the warm wood of the sharps and let his breathing go slow and even, and he did not yet pull the trigger. The shape was joined by another, and another. Rourke counted 7. Down in the kitchen, Jem at the window saw 2 of them peel off and circle to the south the way Rourke had said they would, and he laid the front bead of the Henry on the place in the snow where the first one would have to cross. In the front room, Cass set his shoulder against the wall beside the door and brought the second Henry up against his hip and waited. Della Whitlock, behind the pine sideboard with the buckshot gun across her lap, closed her eyes for one breath and opened them again, and she thought of the man with the soft, dry voice and the eyes the color of pond ice, and the small, precise handwriting on the note pinned to the cabin door. And she thought, you came a very long way for this. So did I. Come up to the porch and let us see who came farther. Out on the open snow, Ambrose Vance stopped 20 paces from the cabin and lifted his hand for his men to halt. He looked at the cabin in the starlight. He looked at the smoke coming out of the chimney in a thin straight line, and at the dark windows and at the heavy front door he could just make out in the gloom, and he smiled the smile that was not a smile. He raised his hand again and brought it down. The first shot of the long night came from his pistol, and it punched into the front shutter of the cabin and splintered the wood and went on across the front room and buried itself in the river stone of the hearth. The second shot came from Rourke Thorne in the loft, and it took the man on Vance's left shoulder, square in the chest, and the man fell back into the snow and did not get up again. Inside the cabin, Della Whitlock picked up the first cartridge from the row on the cloth beside her, and her hand was perfectly steady. The night turned to thunder. Jem at the kitchen window fired and worked the lever and fired again, and the 2 men who had circled south came up against the back wall, and one of them died there and the other dragged himself back into the dark and was not seen again that night. Up in the loft, Rourke fired the long sharps once and reloaded by feel in the dark and fired again. And a third man down on the open snow stopped in mid-stride and stood for a long moment as if he had forgotten where he was going, and then folded slowly down into the drift at his feet. Vance was still moving. Vance was crossing the open snow in a low, fast crouch with 2 men still behind him, and he was coming straight for the front door, and Cass at the door heard the hard, quick scuff of boots on the porch boards and brought the Henry up and put a round through the wood at chest height and heard a man grunt and fall on the other side. The next man came over his fallen partner with a pistol in each hand and shot the bar through the door from outside, and the bar splintered, and the door swung open with the dead weight of the first man riding it inward, and Cass fired the Henry one-handed at 6 paces and put the second man down on top of the first. Vance was the third through the door. Vance came in low and fast the way a man comes through a door who has been doing this kind of work for 20 years, and he had a long blue revolver in each hand, and his face was the same face it had been in the back room of the roadhouse outside Cheyenne, and there was no fear in it, and there was no hurry in it, and there was no anger in it. There was only the dry, patient hunger of a man who had been thinking about one woman for many weeks and had finally arrived at the place where he was going to put his hands on her. He fired at Cass. The bullet caught Cass in the meat of his left shoulder and spun him half around against the door frame, and the Henry clattered down out of his hands and went skidding across the puncheon floor toward the hearth. Vance stepped over the dead men in the doorway and walked into the front room of the Thornridge cabin like a man walking into a church. "Miss Whitlock," he said in a soft, dry voice, "I have come a very long way for you." Della stood up from behind the pine sideboard. She did not have the buckshot gun in her hands. The buckshot gun was on the floor beside the sideboard where she had laid it down a moment before because she had understood in the second after the front door broke, that the buckshot gun was not the gun she was going to need. What she had in her hands was the small Colt pocket revolver that had once belonged to a Glasgow woman named Mary Thorne, and that her son Rourke had put into Della's hand on a snowy afternoon in a lean-to behind the cabin and told her to hold it like a teacup that she did not want to spill. She walked out from behind the sideboard. She walked into the front room of the cabin, and she stopped 6 paces from the man in the gray coat, and she looked into his eyes the color of pond ice, and she said in a voice she barely recognized as her own, "Mr. Vance, my name in this house is Della." He looked at her. For 1/2 second, something moved in his pale eyes that was not the dry, patient hunger and was not the soft, cold smile. It was surprise. It was the surprise of a man who had spent many weeks imagining a frightened woman in a Boston traveling dress and had walked through a broken door expecting to find her cowering in a corner and had instead found her standing 6 paces away with a small revolver held in 2 steady hands the way Rourke had taught her to hold it. "You do not understand," Vance said very quietly. "You think I am here for my brother Theodore, the boy you refused. The boy you humiliated in front of every door he had ever knocked on in Boston society." Della did not answer. "Theodore is dead," Vance said. "Theodore put a pistol against the roof of his mouth in the library of our father's house 6 weeks after you boarded the train west. He left a letter. The letter named you. I burned the letter, and I told the family it was an accident with a fowling piece, and then I came after you." Cass was on one knee against the door frame with his left arm hanging dead at his side and his right hand reaching very slowly along the floor toward the dropped Henry. "Theodore Crane," Vance went on in the same soft, dry voice. "Not Ashford, not Whitmore. Crane. Theodore was my younger brother. I raised him after our parents died of the cholera in '57. I taught him to read. I taught him to ride. I sat up with him through scarlet fever when he was 9 years old. And then a Boston governess in a Navy traveling dress made him so ashamed of being alive that he walked into our father's library and ended himself, and you got on a train and rode west and never even knew his name was wrong." "Mr. Vance," Della said. "Ambrose," he said. "If we are going to be honest, my Christian name is Ambrose. Ambrose Vance Crane. Just Vance in this country. I left the rest of the name back east." He raised the revolver in his right hand and pointed it at the middle of her chest. "Put the pistol down, Miss Whitlock. I am not going to make you suffer. I am going to make it very quick, quicker than my brother had it. That is the only mercy I have left in me, and I am offering it to you because you are a brave woman, and brave women deserve a clean ending." Della did not put the pistol down. What she did was take one slow breath the way Rourke had taught her to breathe before a shot, and she let the breath out the way Rourke had taught her to let it out. And she felt a small tremor that wanted to live in her hands die for one perfect second, and in that second, she pulled the trigger. The little Colt jumped in her hands like a thing alive. The bullet took Ambrose Vance high in the chest, just under the collarbone, in the place Rourke had told her to aim for if she ever had to shoot a man, because it was the place that would put him down without leaving him room to argue. Vance staggered backward 1 step, and the revolver in his right hand went off into the puncheon floor, and the bullet buried itself in the wood by his own boot, and he looked down at the small, dark stain that was already spreading across the front of his gray coat. And he looked up at her with the most surprised expression any man had ever worn. "Oh," he said. Then he sat down hard on the puncheon floor of the Thornridge cabin, and his back came up against the door frame of the kitchen, and his pale eyes went out of focus, and a man named Ambrose Vance Crane, who had crossed half a continent to murder a Boston governess he had never met, died in the warm yellow light of a stranger's front room without saying one more word. Della did not lower the pistol. She stood there in this middle of the room with her hands shaking now. Finally, the way they had not shaken when she needed them not to, and she did not lower the pistol because she could not yet make her arms remember how. It was Cass who got the pistol away from her. He pulled himself up off the floor with his good hand against the door frame, and he crossed the room to her, and he reached up very slowly, and he took the small Colt out of her fingers, and he set it down on the table, and he gathered her against the front of his coat with his one good arm. She put her face into the wool of his shoulder, and she did not make any sound. "Cass, I'm here, Della. Cass, you're shot. I know I am. There is so much blood. It can wait 1 minute." She held on to him with both hands, and he held on to her with the one arm that still worked. And somewhere outside the cabin, Rourke came down out of the loft, and Jem came in from the kitchen, and the two brothers stood in the doorway and looked at the dead men on the porch boards and the dead man on the puncheon floor, and at their oldest brother holding the woman they had all of them in their separate ways come to love. "All right," Jem said quietly after a long moment. "All right, Cass, sit down on the bench. Della, I am going to need you to bring me the basin of hot water and the brown bottle from the top shelf of the pantry and the small leather case from under my bunk in the loft. Rourke, you are going to drag those dead men out of my doorway, and you are going to lay them in the snow by the woodpile, and you are going to leave them there until morning. Then you are going to come back inside, and you are going to let me look at the side of your head, which has started bleeding again." "Yes, Jem." Della went for the basin. Jem worked on Cass for 2 hours. He cut the shirt away from the shoulder, and he washed the wound, and he used the brown bottle on it, which made Cass swear under his breath in 3 languages, 2 of which Della had never heard him speak. The bullet had passed clean through the meat above the collarbone and out the back, missing the bone by a 1/4 inch and missing the artery by less than that. And Jem said very quietly, after he had probed the wound and laid the cloths over it and started to wrap it, that Cass had been born under a kinder star than he had any right to. "That is the 3rd time in my life I have heard you say that," Cass said through his teeth. "It is the 3rd time it has been true, brother." Della sat on the bench beside Cass through all of it. She held his good hand in both of hers. She did not look away when Jem worked the cloth into the wound. She did not look away when Jem stitched the back of the shoulder closed with a curved needle and a length of fine gut. She watched everything Jem did, and she remembered everything Jem did, the way she had decided long ago that she was going to remember every useful thing she was ever shown in her life. And at the end of it, Cass turned his head against the pine boards of the bench and looked at her with his eyes only half open and said, "Della." "Yes, Cass. Marry me." "Yes, Cass. As soon as the preacher can ride up the canyon." "As soon as the preacher can ride up the canyon." He closed his eyes. He slept, then leaning back against the wall with her hand still in his. Jem put a clean blanket over him, and Rourke came back in from the dooryard with snow on his boots, in blood. Not all of it his own, on the cuff of his coat, and the 3 of them sat at the kitchen table in the lamplight and did not say very much. Outside, the wind came back up off the Wind River Range and pressed against the cabin walls the way it had pressed against them on the night Della had first slept under that roof, and the chinking held, and the fire held, and inside the cabin a man slept, and a woman watched him sleep, and 2 brothers kept the watch. The preacher came up the canyon 8 days later. His name was Obadiah Mercer, and he was an old man with a white beard and a long black coat, and a Bible older than he was, and he had been the only ordained minister within 60 miles of Pinedale for 19 years. He came on a borrowed mule because his own horse had gone lame in the thaw, and he came alone, and when Rourke met him at the bottom of the trail and rode in beside him, the old preacher looked over at the young thorn and said, "Son, I have buried more of your kind in this country than I have married. I am pleased to be doing the other thing today." "Yes, sir." "Your brother is alive." "Yes, sir." "And the lady?" "Alive and well, sir, and currently arguing with my brother Jem about whether the front room is clean enough to be married in." Mercer laughed a small, dry old laugh, and they rode on up to the cabin. Della was waiting on the porch. She had on her navy blue traveling dress, the one she had been wearing the day the wagon went over in the canyon and the day Cass had pulled her out of the rocks above it. Jem had cleaned it for her slowly and carefully in a tub of warm water with a small bar of milled soap that Winnie Calloway had sent up the canyon for the purpose. He had pressed it with a flat iron heated on the stove. He had mended the small tear at the hem so neatly that nobody could find it unless they knew exactly where to look. The dress was not white. It was not the dress Della Whitlock had ever once imagined she would be married in. But it was the dress she had walked out of a canyon in, and it was the dress she had stood in front of three strangers in, and it was the dress she meant to wear when she became Della Thorne because she had decided that the dress had earned the right. She had the cameo brooch at her throat, the one her mother had pinned to the front of her own wedding dress in Galway in the year before she had crossed an ocean. Her hair was loose under a small wreath of dried meadow flowers that Rourke had made for her with his own hands badly the night before. She had not let him fix it. She had said it was perfect. Cass was waiting under the old pine. The old pine stood on the south side of the cabin on the edge of the dooryard, and it had been planted by the boy's father in the spring of '57, the year the family had finished the long wagon road up out of St. Louis. The tree was now 21 years old and twice the height of a man. Jem and Rourke had cleared a half circle of bare ground under it and laid down a buffalo robe for the bride and groom to stand on, and they had brought out the long bench from the cabin for the preacher to set his Bible on, and the country in every direction had gone the soft, pale green of high country in the second week of April, and there were cornflowers up along the south wall of the barn. Cass stood under the pine in his cleanest shirt and his only black coat. His left arm was still in a sling that Jem had made for him out of a strip of clean cotton, and he held his hat in his right hand, and his beard was combed for the second time in his life with bear grease, and his boots were polished. And when Della came down the porch steps on Rourke's arm and walked across the bare ground toward him under the old pine, his honey-colored eyes filled the way no Thorne brother had ever seen Cassius Thorne's eyes fill in their lives. Old Mercer opened the Bible. He did not read very long. He had been doing this work for 50 years, and he had learned that the words a man and a woman remembered from a wedding were not the words from the book, but the words they spoke to each other. And so he kept the book part short and got out of the way and gave the floor to the bride and groom. Cass spoke first. "Della Whitlock," he said, and his voice was rougher than he meant it to be. "I am not a man of soft speech. I told you so in my first letter, and I have proved it to you in every day since. But I am going to try to say a thing while in the delight in front of God and my brothers and this old man with his Bible that I should have said to you the night you came down a ladder in my front room." He stopped. He swallowed. "I have spent my whole life on this mountain," he said. "I built this cabin with my father and my brothers. I buried my mother under that aspen yonder when I was 21 years old. I came home from a war that should have killed me, and I came up to this country, and I made a life out of weather and timber and the work of my own hands, and I told myself for 12 years that I did not need anything else. And then I wrote a letter to a woman I had never seen because some quiet voice in me would not stop saying that it was not true that I needed nothing else. And the woman wrote me back, and I read her letters by this fire all through one summer and one fall, and I memorized the way she wrote her capital letters, and I rode out into a January storm to meet her, and I was too late." His good hand was shaking. "I thought I had lost you before I had ever seen your face. And then I came down into a canyon, and I found a footprint in the snow, and I climbed up into rocks. I had no business climbing in that weather, and I found you under an overhang, with your eyes closed and your lips the color of a bruise. And I picked you up, and I carried you home, and I have not been the same man since the moment your head fell against my chest in that snow." He was not crying. He was not the kind of man who cried in the daylight, but his eyes were the color of strong honey held up to a window, and they were very full. "Della, I am going to be your husband for as many years as the good Lord lets me. I am going to keep you warm. I am going to keep you safe. I am going to keep you company. I am going to bring you a tin cup of coffee on the cold mornings, and I am going to read books in the evenings beside you, and I am going to grow old in this house with you, and I am going to be buried under that aspen yonder beside my mother when my time comes. A man keeps his word, Della. I am giving you my word." Della Whitlock looked up at him in the spring sunlight. Cassius Thorne, she said, and her voice did not shake at all. I came west because I was afraid. I came west because a man in a great house in Boston had decided he wanted what he could not be given, and I had nowhere left to run. I crossed a continent on a train and a stagecoach and a wagon, and I do not remember being warm one single hour of that journey. I remember thinking on the last morning that I was going to step down off the wagon at South Pass and meet a stranger and try to be the kind of woman he needed because that was the bargain I had made, and because I keep my bargains. She stopped. She put her hand against the front of his black coat over the place where his heart was. And then I woke up in a loft I did not know, she said, and I went to the head of a ladder I did not know, and I looked down into the front room of a cabin I did not know, and there were three men around a fire, and one of them turned around and looked up at me with eyes the color of strong honey, held up to a window, and held up his palms so that I could see them, and told me the truth before he told me anything else. And I have been home ever since that moment. I just did not have the word for it yet. She lifted her chin. A woman keeps her word too, Cass Thorne. I am giving you mine. For as many years as the good Lord lets me, in sickness and in health, in the summer and in the long white winters, in Thorn Ridge and in any other country we may ever stand on together. I am yours and you are mine, and we are home. Old Mercer pronounced them man and wife in the spring sunlight under the old pine, and Cass bent his head and kissed her slow and gentle, in the way of a man who had been waiting his whole life to be allowed to do it. And Rourke let out a wild high whoop that startled every bird in the dooryard up out of the brush, and Jem lifted the fiddle to his shoulder and played the Scots air that Della's mother had once sung, and the old preacher closed his Bible and wiped his eyes with a folded handkerchief and pretended he was not. That night, the cabin door closed behind them, and outside the last small flurries of an April snowfall came down on the new green of the dooryard, and the fire in the front room burned warm and steady. And what passed between Cass Thorne and Della Thorne in the loft above that fire was their own and belonged to no one else. And when the morning came, they came down the loft ladder together for the first time, and the sun was on the mountains, and the long white winter was finally and entirely over. The letter from Boston came in the third week of May. It was carried up the canyon by a young rider out of Pinedale who had ridden it the last leg himself because Winnie Calloway had paid him a silver dollar to make sure it got into Della Thorne's own hand. Della took the letter on the porch in the late afternoon sunlight, with Cass standing beside her, and she broke the seal and read it once and read it twice, and then she sat down on the porch step very slowly and read it a third time. The letter was from a Boston attorney named Pemberton. Pemberton wrote to inform Miss Adelaide Whitlock, last known address, Boston, now believed to be residing somewhere in the Wyoming territory, that her former employer Theodore Crane had passed from this life on the 11th of October last by his own hand in the library of his father's house. Pemberton wrote that the Crane family fortunes had since passed in their entirety to Theodore's elder brother Ambrose, and that Ambrose Vance Crane had himself been reported deceased some weeks ago in the Wyoming territory in circumstances not entirely clear, and that the Crane estate, having now no living heir, had reverted under an old codicil written by Theodore in the last weeks of his life to the woman Theodore had named therein as the only person he had ever truly cared for. The codicil named Adelaide Whitlock. The estate, Pemberton wrote, came to a sum of slightly more than $50,000 in cash securities in the income from a small block of Boston tenements. Della folded the letter in half on her lap and looked up at her husband in the spring sunlight. Cass, I heard. It is a great deal of money. It is. It is more money than this ranch will earn in 20 years of good seasons. It is. It is enough money that I could go back to Boston tomorrow and live in a house with 12 windows and never lift my hands to a stove again for the rest of my life. Cass did not say anything to this. He stood beside her on the porch with his hat in his hand, and he looked out across the dooryard at the line of pines down by the creek, and he waited, the way he had been waiting in one form or another since the morning she had come down a ladder in his front room. Della stood up. She walked into the cabin and she went to the small writing desk in the corner of the front room, the one Cass had built for her with his own hands in the second week of April as a wedding present, and she took out a fresh sheet of paper and she sat down and she wrote her reply to the Boston attorney Pemberton in the small, careful hand that Cass had memorized over 6 months of letters in the autumn before she came west. She wrote that she was in receipt of his letter. She wrote that she was grateful for his diligence. She wrote that she had no interest in the Crane estate, none whatsoever, and that she wished the entire sum less his reasonable fees to be divided into 3 equal parts and given to the 3 orphan houses in the city of Boston, where she herself had been raised between the ages of 9 and 17. She named the houses by name. She wrote that the gift was to be made anonymously in the name of a Boston governess who had once lived under their roofs and would always remember their kindness, and that under no circumstances was her own name to appear on any of the house's rolls. She signed the letter Della Thorne of Thorn Ridge, Wyoming Territory. She folded the letter and sealed it and brought it back out onto the porch and put it in Cass's good hand. "Will you ride this down to Pinedale tomorrow," she said, "and put it on the next stage east?" "I will." He looked down at the folded letter in his hand, and then he looked up at his wife. "Della." "Yes, Cass. You are sure about this?" "I have everything I want, Cass. I built this with my own hands. Or at least I am going to with you in the years that the good Lord lets us have. There is nothing in Boston I need." He looked at her for a long moment in the spring sunlight, and then he put the letter in the breast pocket of his shirt over his heart, and he said very quietly, "Built this with our own hands, Della. Built this with our own hands, Cass." The years came on after that, the way years come on, in good country, slowly, and one season at a time. And they were good to the people in the cabin called Thorn Ridge. The first summer is the summer Della learned to garden. Jem had broken her a small patch of ground on the south side of the cabin with the spade and the mattock, and she put in beans and squash and onions and a row of carrots, and the beans took, and the squash took, and the onions took, and the carrots came up small and twisted but edible. And Della stood at the edge of her garden in late August with her hands on her hips and a smear of dirt on her cheek, and laughed out loud at the sight of her own carrots. The first child came in the spring of '79. He was a boy, and they named him Jasper after no one in particular except the warm color of the stone Della had once seen in a jeweler's window in Boston when she was 11 years old. Jem delivered him on the bed in the loft on a night in early May, while Cass walked back and forth in the front room, and Rourke sat on the porch step with his head in his hands. Jem came down the loft ladder at 4 in the morning with the baby in a clean cloth and put him into Cass's arms, and Cassius Thorne, who had not cried in the daylight in 20 years, sat down on the bench by the front door with his son in his arms and wept like a child himself, and Jem and Rourke turned away to give him the small dignity of doing it alone. Rourke married Tessa Bowen of Pinedale in the autumn of 1880. Tessa was the daughter of the blacksmith, and she had been watching Rourke Thorne ride into town for years and waiting for him to notice her. And on the afternoon Rourke finally noticed her, she walked out from behind her father's forge with a streak of charcoal on her cheek and looked up at him on his black horse and said, "Rourke Thorne, it took you long enough." They were married 3 months later in the same small white church where old Mercer had once preached, and they came home to Thorn Ridge to live in a new wing that Cass and Jem and Rourke had built onto the cabin in the long warm days of August. The second child came in the autumn of 1881. She was a girl, and they named her Emmeline after no one but the soft sound of the name itself. She had her father's honey-colored eyes and her mother's small, careful mouth, and from the first week of her life, she would not be still in any arms but Cass's, and Cass took to carrying her around the dooryard in the crook of his good arm while he did the small chores of the morning, and Rourke called her from then on Cass's shadow. The third child came in the spring of 1883. He was a boy, and they named him Hollis, and he was the wildest of the three from the first week of his life, and he reminded Rourke of himself in a way that Rourke pretended to find tiresome and clearly did not. Jem married late. He married a woman named Cordelia Hayes in the autumn of 1889 when he was 42 years old and she was 37 and a widow with no children of her own. And they had two children of their own in the years after a boy named Silas and a girl named June and Jem played his fiddle for them by the fire on winter evenings, the way he had once played it for the woman who had come down a ladder in his brother's house. The Wyoming country went on around them. The seasons turned and the snows came and went, and the cattle on the lower meadows grew from the original 20 head to 200 head, and Cass and Jem and Rourke built fences and broke horses and dug wells and lost a calf or two in every spring storm and counted themselves lucky to have lost no more than that. There were hard winters. There was a year in '87 when the snow came down in October and stayed until April, and they lost more than they could afford to lose, and Della stood at the kitchen window on a March morning of that year and watched her husband ride out into the white country one more time to look for a stray, and she thought very quietly, winter always ends. And it did. It always did. There was a loss. Winnie Calloway died in the autumn of 1890, full of years and warm tea and gossip, and the whole town of Pinedale turned out for her funeral, and the Thorns came down from the canyon as one family, and Della Thorne stood at the graveside in her navy blue traveling dress and the cameo brooch at her throat and cried for the woman who had once pulled her into a hug that smelled of lavender and cinnamon, and Cass stood beside her and held her hand the whole time. They went home to Thornridge after that, and the cabin held them. The years went on. In the spring of 1898, 20 years to the month after Della Whitlock had first walked down a loft ladder in the front room of the Thornridge cabin, the four Thorns and their families gathered in the dooryard for the wedding of Jasper Thorne, the eldest son of Cassius and Della, who was 19 years old and tall as his father, and quiet as his uncle Jem, and who was marrying a girl out of Pinedale named Hannah Mercer, granddaughter of the old preacher who had once stood under the pine and pronounced his parents man and wife. Della Thorne, age 42, watched her son take his vows in the same dooryard where she had taken her own. She had silver in her honey-colored hair now. There were small lines at the corners of her cornflower eyes from 20 years of squinting at Wyoming sunlight on Wyoming snow. Her hands were not the soft hands of a Boston governess any longer. They were the hands of a Wyoming rancher's wife, and they had broken suet and kneaded bread and held 3 babies and fired a Sharps rifle on a summer afternoon when Rourke had decided she ought to be able to handle the long gun as well as the short one, and she had grown to love them more than she had ever loved her own old soft hands. Cass stood beside her in the dooryard. He was 53 years old, and his beard was more gray than brown now, and he walked with a small, slow limp on his left side from a fall off a horse the spring before, but his shoulders were still wide, and his hands were still warm, and his eyes were still the color of strong honey held up to a window. He had his good arm around her waist, and she had her head against his shoulder, and they watched their oldest boy take a wife under the old pine, and neither of them said anything for a long time. That evening after the wedding supper, after Jem had played the fiddle until his fingers were tired, and Rourke had told 3 of his oldest stories twice each, and the cousins had chased each other around the dooryard until they had to be picked up and carried inside, one by their parents. Cass and Della Thorne walked up the small rise behind the cabin where the family grave stood under the old aspen tree. They stood there in the long blue evening light. The aspen had grown. The wind moved its leaves in the small, soft way aspens move their leaves in the spring of the year, and there were 2 stones under the tree, one for the boy's father and one for the boy's mother, and there was a 3rd stone that had been set there some years before for old Winnie Calloway, because she had asked on her deathbed to be buried in country she could see the mountains from. Della put her hand in Cass's. Cass. Yes, Della. Do you remember the day I came? Every day of my life. I was so cold. I know you were. I thought I was going to die under that overhang. I know you did. And then a man with a beard and a sheepskin coat picked me up and carried me 18 miles through the snow and laid me on a bed in a loft. And I woke up in a house I did not know with 3 strangers around a fire, and I came down a ladder and I made a bargain with one of them with my bare feet on his floor. I remember. Cass, yes. This is where I was always going. I just did not know the name of it until I got here. He turned her toward him in the long blue evening light, and he put his good arm around her, and he looked down into the cornflower eyes that had been the first thing he had truly seen in his life, and would be he knew the last. You are home now, Della Thorne, he said quietly. You always were. You just had to come a long way to find out where home was. You are home too, Cass Thorne. I know I am. I have known since the morning you came down a ladder in my front room. Down in the dooryard, the fiddle started up again. Jem was playing the Scots air that Della's mother had once sung, the same song he had played the first night, the same song that had been on the wind under the old pine on the day she had become Della Thorne. The music came up the rise to them on the small evening breeze, and they could hear faintly their daughter Emmeline singing the second verse the way Della had taught her to sing it, the way Della's own mother had taught her, the way the song had passed down a chain of women from a kitchen in Galway to a kitchen in Boston to a kitchen in the Wyoming high country. Cass took his wife's hand in his. Built this with our own hands, Della? Built this with our own hands, Cass. Behind them, the sun went down behind the Wind River Range, and the long shadow of the mountain came across the cabin and across the barn and across the long green country, and the lamps in the windows of Thornridge came on one by one in the gathering blue, and somewhere down in the dooryard a child laughed and a fiddle played, in a long white winter that had begun 20 years before in a canyon full of snow, finally completely and forever ended.